Like gender theory, environmentalism is a modern, liberal, Western luxury belief system. We can't produce cricket energy bars and tofu burgers quickly enough and distribute them widely enough to feed everybody. Mass starvation is, as they say, a feature, not a bug.
Matt Walsh is a political commentator that leans towards the conservative side, and in one of his more recent videos, he's made comments on what his thoughts are about moving towards a more plant-based agricultural system. He reviews an interview that was on the news with a particular individual who starts to talk about the risks of using animal agriculture as a primary means for farming, and Matt Walsh has some disagreements with what this individual says. So we're going to have a look at what Matt Walsh has to say, have a look at what his reasons are for believing the things that he has to say, and try to not debunk, not destroy him, nothing with necessarily negative intent, but we're just going to try to positively contribute to the discussion and see if we can offer some things against what Matt Walsh has to say that might help change his mind on the subject, or might help at least give him something more to think about. So before we get into this, I just want to acknowledge that, of course, you can probably tell from the name of my channel that I do have some biases already that will probably contribute to how I interpret particular information. So it's important to get those out there. So for one, I'm vegan myself. I don't consume any animal products. My reason for originally doing that was in relation to ethics, the way that animals are treated, the things that I've seen that are standard practice in the industry. So that is going to be something that will probably impact how I perceive information. That being said, I still do my best to try and be as objective as possible when looking at information, but there's going to be room for error there. So keeping that in mind, let's move forward and have a look at what Matt has to say.
When I went to Africa visiting the Maasai tribe for my film, What is a Woman, I, of course, discovered that gender theory simply doesn't exist in that part of the world at all. We had so much to talk about around that subject that I didn't have time to ask them about other Western liberal inventions, which is probably for the best, because they already thought that I was insane enough as it was. But I imagine that if I'd continued down the left-wing checklist, we would have gotten the same guffaws and confused head-scratching and looks of pity. And this especially includes, actually, the subject of environmentalism. I'm pretty certain that if I had asked the Maasai how they feel about the environment and whether they identify as environmentalists, the question would have made as much sense as asking them whether men can have babies. And this would hold true all across the non-Western world. Like gender theory, environmentalism is a modern, liberal, Western luxury belief system.
Matt makes a good point, right? Environmentalism is something that you can only be concerned about if you're in a privileged position. And he tries to say this in order to say that therefore we shouldn't be worried about it, right? Therefore we shouldn't try to create this thing that we wouldn't be worried about if we were in a survival mindset. But I think his point that he's making here actually goes against him, because if we are in a position where we are not worried about getting food, not worried about getting water, not worried about not getting eaten by lions, for example, or trying to seek medical attention because we can just have access to hospitals. We can just go to the grocery store and buy food and water and everything we need. We're now in a position where we don't have to worry about that. So we have the privilege, we have the ability now to be able to say, okay, hold on. I can actually look at our food system, see how sustainable it is, see if it's negatively impacting me or anyone else, and make changes accordingly. So if you're in a tribe, you can't do that, right? But if you're in a privileged Western position, you can do that. And I think because we're in a position where we can do that, we have a responsibility to do that and make the decisions that have the best outcomes for people. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at some of this information that we only have access to because we are privileged, because we're in the West, and try to see what the best option appears to be here. This paper by the World Bank clearly states that the main cause of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest is making way for cattle. On top of that, we also have this report that states that 93% of land clearing in Queensland in Australia was to make room for cattle, and Queensland accounts for approximately 2/3 of Australia's land clearing. So this means basically making room for cattle is the main cause of land clearing in both Australia and in the Amazon rainforest. And there are a multitude of other reports that state that it's also the main cause in pretty much all around the world. But here's the kicker. Here's the really big thing about this. So If we continue to eat the way we currently do, by 2050, we will need to use 55% more land than we do now, according to this report here. So what does this mean? This means that, okay, we already use a ridiculous amount of land to clear room, to make room for cattle. And if we continue doing this with the increasing population as we're currently going, we will undoubtedly eventually need to make adjustments here because we just won't have the space to be able to do this indefinitely. So because we're in our privileged position, we can see this and we still have time to do something about it, right? So the question is now, is there something more sustainable, better that we can do that won't result in this ridiculous amount of land that we will need that just isn't sustainable for the future? And the answer here is yes, absolutely. So we have a couple of reports here. The first one, vegan diets are associated with less greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, and land use. The second one, animal products use way more water than nutritiously equivalent plant alternatives, right? So the key there is nutritiously equivalent because we can get just as many nutrients as we need from plant-based products as we can from animal-based products. So nutritiously equivalent plant-based alternatives can give us the same nutrients we need without using anywhere near as much water, right? So that's a big one because water is pretty important for human survival. And here's a really, really big report, right? So this report found that if worldwide we switch to a vegan, predominantly or entirely plant-based source of agriculture, source of farming, getting all of our nutrients from plants, we could feed an additional 4 billion people. So that's pretty big, right? We have now seen, because we're in such a privileged Western society, that we can look and we can see that, okay, the way we're currently farming is ridiculous, uses so much land, it's not sustainable considering future population growth, and if we just switch over to a plant-based diet, which we have seen we can get the same nutrients from, we will actually be able to feed 4 billion additional people. So it is more sustainable in every possible way, even if you don't care about greenhouse gas emissions, right? Even if you don't care about that. It's more sustainable and you can feed more people. So that's pretty huge. And to tie this back to my original point, the reason we're looking at this is because we can only see this because we're in a privileged Western position. So to say that because the African tribes don't think this, therefore we shouldn't think it. It's like, okay, but the African tribes also don't have access to the information that we have access to. And because we have access to that information, it's arguable that we have a moral responsibility to do what is in their best interest. Because if we know what we're doing is as destructive as I've just outlined, and we choose not to do anything about it, then, that's kind of a dick move as far as I'm concerned.
It's by far and away the greatest cause of habitat destruction, the greatest cause of wildlife loss, the greatest cause of extinction, greatest cause of soil loss, greatest cause of freshwater use. It's one of the greatest causes of climate breakdown, bigger than transport, one of the primary causes of water pollution and of air pollution. So it's right at the top. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to say land use, the biggest issue of all. It's by far and away the greatest form of land use that humans inflict on the planet, which means all that land is land which can't be used for wild ecosystems. And while obviously we need farming, we need to minimize those impacts. We need to act as drastically within that sector as any other sector to prevent the collapse of our life support systems. And what that means, above all else, is getting out of livestock farming, is really shutting down animal farming altogether, because that has massively disproportionate impacts on the living planet. And we need to switch towards other sources of food, plant-based diets, which are far more efficient, far lower environmental impacts, but also switch out of farming altogether to produce protein-rich foods, which we can do through precision fermentation, brewing microbes.
I can hear farmers all over the small country of ours shocked and perhaps screaming at their televisions because they're saying, are you saying all animal farming, and in your opinion, really needs to stop?
Yes, it does. It really does. It's a bit like leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Unless we do that, we've really got very little chance indeed of preventing this domino effect of system collapse right across Earth systems, which basically makes the planet uninhabitable. So eating meat and milk and eggs is an indulgence we cannot afford.
Now, we know that George is an anti-human psychopath based on the fact that, as we see in the video there, he hangs his picture frames from wires suspended from the ceiling. His home decor is Exactly the sort of thing that you see right before you're skinned alive and dismembered. Of course, for liability and legal reasons, I am not directly alleging that George is a serial killer. I'm just saying that I would be surprised if he wasn't. And whether he personally murders people or not, we do know that he subscribes to a murderous ideology. Climate alarmists, like George, are anti-human, anti-civilization. They see all of humanity, well, most of it anyway, with the exception of themselves, as a blight, a stain, a parasite on the face of the earth.
All right, so I just want to quickly take a pause here and just discuss the fact that Matt is clearly of the opinion that the primary narrative surrounding greenhouse gas emissions and the climate crisis is that the people purporting these are climate alarmists. It's not really that bad. Now, in this video, I'm not going to discuss that because that's a completely separate topic, but it seems that he only really identifies what the interviewee there, what the individual speaking there described as Earth's life support systems. The only one Matt really found there was the climate crisis, greenhouse gas emissions. But here's the thing. Even if we don't care about greenhouse gas emissions whatsoever, even if we don't care about them at all, we don't think there is any climate crisis, there is still very, very clear evidence that by continuing to use animal farming, we are deeply, deeply threatening our ability to survive as a human species, right? We're deeply threatening our ability to be able to continue society as it is. So greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, that's one. Right now, I'm just going to quickly do an overview using some research to look at some of the other life support systems that we as humans need and are currently being threatened by the use of animal farming as our primary method of gaining food. Okay, so let's have a look at some ways that that's happening. So for those who aren't aware, antibiotic resistance is essentially bacteria or microbes that are resistant to antibiotics. Antibiotics no longer work on them. And the way that that essentially happens is the overprescription of antibiotics. And part of that is in humans, but doctors giving people antibiotics that they don't necessarily need. But a large part, in fact, the majority of antibiotics are given to farm animals. And the reason that this happens is because these farm animals are in such terrible conditions that they are in situations where they have to be essentially given antibiotics to stop them from getting sick enough so that they don't die before they become profitable, right? So they have to put these antibiotics in the animal's food so that they don't get sick, or at least to prevent high levels of them getting sick so that the numbers that they can process, slaughter, kill, are still highly profitable. And the process of doing this promotes antibiotic-resistant bacteria that can then spread to humans and essentially stop our antibiotics that we use for human care from working. And it's been said that this can actually send us back to the medicinal stone age, essentially, where antibiotics will no longer work. And it's been predicted that by 2050, I think it's going to cause something like 10 million deaths per year, which is going to be more than those who die from cancer. Right, so that's a pretty big thing that we need to pay attention to. So let's have a look at specifically how this happens. So this study essentially talks about how antibiotic resistance can occur as a result of antibiotics being used in animal agriculture, both as a direct result of the antibiotic resistant bacteria spreading in the animal themselves, then being transferred to human beings, but also those antibiotic resistant bacteria being transferred into the fecal matter of the animals, and then that matter being used as manure or for growing our crops as well. So we're basically flooding our entire system with antibiotic resistance by farming animals, even our plant-based crops, right? So this is impacting us vegetarians and vegans as well, just because people are still using antibiotics in the animal-based farming sector. So that's a really big threat. It's huge. Now, a commentary paper here states antibiotic resistance has already reached a crisis. Antibiotics discovery has plummeted, yet resistance to existing antibiotics is increasing rapidly. So our discovery rate of new antibiotics is going down, but our rate of antibiotic resistance is actually going up. So we can see how that's going to be a problem, right? If we continue this system of producing food, we are going to have even more antibiotic resistance, and we're going to have less antibiotics available. And this study here found that the use of antibiotics in animal food production is set to increase by 67% from 2010 to 2030. So it's only going to get worse. And a large reason for that is because we're going to have a growing population, and we're also going to have to produce more animals. And that means we're going to have to confine them even more. So feed more animals, more antibiotics, more of the time, to feed more people, an unnecessary diet that is more destructive to the environment. It doesn't seem like a very good way to go. So that's a general overview of one of our life support systems, antibiotic resistance. It's not just climate alarmism. Antibiotic resistance is huge. It's another threat. And even if you don't care about the climate crisis, you should be caring about that. That's enormous. Absolutely enormous. So essentially, most of our oxygen comes from the ocean. Most people think it's trees, but it's actually the ocean. It's, it depends on what specific citation you're looking at, but it's anywhere from 70 to 80% of our oxygen comes from the ocean. So what that means is, if we have a large portion of the ocean having dead zones, we're not going to get the majority of our oxygen supply. That's not looking good for us there, right? So if we see that the way we're producing food is creating a large amount of an increasing amount of ocean dead zones, that's something that we should look at and think to ourselves, okay, how do we stop that from happening? What's a step we can take to reduce that? So let's have a look and see if animal agriculture is a main cause of ocean dead zones. So here we have nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural runoff are the primary culprits. But sewage, vehicular and industrial emissions, and even natural factors also play a role in the development of dead zones. So the main cause is agriculture runoff. So logically speaking, just as a logical follow-on from that, is that if we can reduce the amount of agriculture necessary, we can then also reduce the amount of dead zones, right? That logically that tracks, right? So we already know that if we use a vegan-based food system, we will use less land. That was highlighted earlier on, right? And we will have to produce less crops because most crops are grown to feed to animals to fatten them up enough for us to eat. So if we eliminate animal farming, we actually don't need to grow as many crops as we currently do to feed them, which means less fertilizer being used overall, which means less runoff into the ocean, which means less ocean dead zones. So logically, it checks out that if we reduce or eliminate animal product farming, then we will have less ocean dead zones, and that will be much less of a threat. And then we can then work to reduce or reverse the ocean dead zones that already exist. So eliminating animal agriculture is absolutely a good solution to that problem.
He obviously knows that we can't produce cricket energy bars and tofu burgers quickly enough and distribute them widely enough to feed everybody.
So here he's actually right. We can't suddenly just close all the animal farms and then have enough food to feed everyone. There is going to have to be a transitional period, but assuming we actually start now, where we still have some time, we can do that transitional period, right? We can say, all right, look, let's gradually move animal farmers over to plant-based agricultural systems, give them jobs, maintain their jobs in that system, and that way, once we complete that, because we've done it over such a gradual amount of time, we're good to go. And we have enough food to feed everyone. Plus, as we stated earlier when we looked at that study, potentially an additional 4 billion people can now be fed that otherwise wouldn't be able to because we're using our resources more effectively and efficiently. So it seems like we can't do it all of a sudden, of course, but we can do it gradually. And if we're going to do it gradually, we have to start now.
Billions of people in the world depend on livestock farming to survive, especially in poor countries. The Maasai subsists almost entirely on goats and cows. Take those away and they'll all starve to death. Billions of people will starve along with them. Environmentalists know this and they're just okay with it. More than okay, it's what they want.
I just want to be clear here. The prescription, the recommendation is not that we should invade developing countries and forcibly remove their goat farms and leave them to their own devices, saying you cannot kill goats anymore. No, the prescription is, okay, industrialized animal agriculture needs to be gradually and sustainably transitioned in a way where everyone keeps their job to a plant-based agricultural system. And this is happening in developed countries, right? Once we get it down in developed countries, we will have enough food to feed an additional 4 billion people, which will give it will make more food available, right? So we don't want people to starve to death, and the result of this won't be people starving to death at all. So no, we don't want people to starve to death. We want the very opposite of that. And if we do transition to plant-based agriculture, the opposite of that will happen according to the literature.
Human civilization is based on agriculture. It was born from and by agriculture. It was only after the development of agriculture that civilizations formed in the first place. The Neolithic Revolution saw humanity move away from primitive, nomadic, hunter-gatherer societies that could not really thrive or grow on any kind of wide scale, to the cultivation of plants and animals and the forming of organized permanent settlements. It's not an exaggeration to say that people like George literally want to bring us back to the Stone Age.
Okay, this is really interesting. So really, all this is, it seems really logical in the first instance, right? But all this is, it's just an appeal to history. It's an appeal to tradition. That's all it is. And I think Matt's logic, if we continue along his line of reasoning, it actually leads us to see that we need to move away from animal-based farming. So what Matt's essentially saying here is we once had a method of farming, which was hunter-gathering, which did not allow us to truly thrive. And we then had the agricultural revolution, which allowed us to thrive. It took out all of the stress of farming. It took out all of the things that essentially threatened our ability to survive. We didn't have to worry about hunting saber-toothed tigers. We didn't have to worry about, actually going out and finding food. We could just farm it, produce it sustainably and predictably. But here's the thing. Now that method of farming is threatening to send us back to the Stone Age. That method of farming is threatening to take away the effectiveness of antibiotics. That method of farming is threatening to destroy every single tree on the planet. That method of farming is the primary cause of ocean dead zones, which produce the oxygen that we need to survive, right? So if we continue down there, that's what's going to send us to the Stone Age, specifically the medical Stone Age is in relation to antibiotic resistance, right? So what we need to do now is come up with a way where we can adapt, evolve, because evolution doesn't stop, does it, Matt? It continues to happen. There are consistently new barriers that are in place that you have to overcome. Our current barrier is animal agriculture, requiring a large amount of antibiotics, destroying most of our land, using up most of our fresh water, a growing population, and the projections being that we cannot rely on this to survive. So what do we do? And a suggestion here is we could do lab-grown meat. If people need meat, we could do lab-grown meat, uses way less resources, solves basically all of these problems, which means that we are successfully adapting to the obstacle in front of us. So I'm not quite sure what his issue with this is. I think the only reason he holds this opinion here is that he's unaware of the true threats that animal agriculture faces because he just lumps it into the categorization of, environmentalists. But it's like, think about it, read the literature, and you'll see that we do need to evolve again. We do need to adapt again, and we got to do that sooner rather than later. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you copy the URL of this YouTube video and paste it on Matt's most recent video. Try to get him to see it, so hopefully he could contemplate some of the things that I've said, I suppose, and maybe I can help change his mind on something, I hope. So, all right, bye.